Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to our Curious Amalgam. I'm Alicia Downey, and the title of today's episode is A Sickness or a Cure for High Drug Prices: Why Pharmacy Benefit Managers Are Under the Antitrust Microscope. The manufacture and distribution of prescription drugs is a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States, an industry in which the availability and affordability of a product may be a matter of life and death for many consumers. The U.S. healthcare system involves a notoriously complicated network of buyers and sellers of goods and services, of which insurers, pharmacies, healthcare providers, and patients are only a few of the participants. In this episode, we'll be focusing on pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs, who are intermediaries in the insurance-covered drug supply chain. We'll hear an economist's take on the Federal Trade Commission's targeting of PBMs and their business practices as the subject of study and potential antitrust enforcement proceedings. My co-host today is Jeny Maier. Hi, Jeny.
Hey, Alicia. So good to be here today.
Jeny, would you like to introduce our guest and kick off the conversation?
Absolutely. I'm so excited to. So our guest today is Dr. Erin Trish. Dr. Trish is the co-director of the University of Southern California's Schaeffer Center for Health Policy and Economics, and she's an associate professor of pharmaceutical and health economics at the USC Mann School of Pharmacy. She is also a non-resident fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution. Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, Professor Trish.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Over the last number of years, as Alicia was saying in our introduction, there's been an increasing amount of public outcry over drug prices, in particular, the amount that patients are paying for their drugs. And at the same time, we're starting to hear more and more complaints about PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers, and their role in these issues. Many of our listeners in the antitrust world have likely seen that the Federal Trade Commission last year kicked off a market study pursuant to Section 6B of the FTC Act in order to study PBMs and their business practices, their impact on competition, and their impact on patients' access and affordability of drugs. Perhaps starting from the beginning, Dr. Trish, explain to us what functions do PBMs play in the healthcare system, and how has that role evolved over the last, say, 20, 25 years?
Sure. Thank you. So as you mentioned, it's a very complicated system, and pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs, sort of sit in the nexus of several different negotiations that are happening simultaneously. So most PBMs work on behalf of health plans or employers providing employer-sponsored coverage to their workers. They're negotiating prices with prescription drug manufacturers, right? So there's something called a list price of a drug, which is sort of the price that you might hear about in the news or the price you might see in some reporting. But behind the scenes, the PBMs are going and negotiating with those drug manufacturers and saying, essentially, if you give us after the fact rebate or discount, we will encourage more of our patients to take your product instead of your competitor's product by putting it on what's called a lower tier, or, basically giving it favorable placement in our formulary design. So the patient may face lower cost sharing by choosing that preferred drug. And in turn, that gives the PBMs the leverage to go to the manufacturers and say, we want a bigger rebate or a bigger discount. So there's one negotiation that's going on between the PBMs and the manufacturers over what's called the net price of the drug, net of those concessions or discounts. Then they're also going and negotiating with the pharmacies about when the patient actually goes and fills the prescription, how much is the PBM going to pay the pharmacy for dispensing that product to the patient. And if you can imagine, if I had a slide, there'd be a lot of boxes and arrows going every which way between all of these entities, but the PBM kind of sits at the middle of that. Now, historically, PBMs played a very important role. You asked about the last 20 or 25 years. They were very influential in getting patients to switch over to generic drugs as they became available. And that provided a lot of efficiencies for the healthcare system to get patients to switch over quickly to these generic products. But what's happened more recently is that there's a lot of opacity in this market, or lack of transparency. And the issues have become much more around these rebates and the differences between the prices that they're negotiating with manufacturers, how much of those savings they're passing on to their end clients, and how much they're reimbursing pharmacies, and ultimately the net effect that has on patients' experience, on the patient's experience at the pharmacy counter as well.
So in response to the FTC's request last year for public comments about their PBM inquiry, you and several of your colleagues from USC had made a submission to the FTC describing some research that you all had done on various different areas related to PBM activities. And one of the areas that you highlighted in your submission is vertical integration. How has this kind of vertical integration manifested itself in PBM's businesses, and what has the consequences been for different parties across the pharmaceutical supply chain?
Sure. So I think one, to kind of, put some flavor on this, right? PBMs are probably companies that you would have heard of, right? Historically, it was Medco, Express Scripts. They've now been kind of rolled up into larger corporate structures that typically also include an insurer, perhaps a pharmacy or a specialty pharmacy, and often also healthcare providers. So the three biggest PBMs today process over 80% of the prescriptions that go through the U.S. healthcare system. So this is CVS, United, and Express Scripts, now part of Cigna and Evernorth. And I think it's important to kind of realize just how big these entities have become. CVS and United are actually the fourth and fifth ranked companies on the Fortune 500, right? The fourth and fifth biggest companies by revenue in America. So fourth and fifth only to Walmart, Apple, and Amazon, right? These are pretty big entities that we're talking about. And so as they've become more vertically integrated with these other aspects of the healthcare system and the pharmacy supply chain, this raises questions about, for example, whether a PBM, when it's affiliated with a health plan, is it going to offer less attractive terms to unaffiliated health plans compared with those that it offers to its own health plan in an attempt to strengthen its competitive position in the insurance market? Another example on the pharmacy side would be, is the PBM going to offer more attractive reimbursement to its affiliated pharmacies than to other pharmacies in an attempt to foreclose on rival competition in pharmacy markets? And those are, as these companies have become bigger and more vertically integrated, those are the types of issues that really need to be better understood and better studied, and are part of what's being investigated, at least to my knowledge, as part of the FTC's 6B investigation.
Yeah, and that 6B investigation is, so wide-ranging, but really interesting for our listeners to take a look at what exactly they're investigating. It's pretty surprising and really a deep study. One of the things that we have heard a lot about for those of us paying attention to these healthcare and pharmaceutical markets in terms of the public outcry to the agencies of late has been all the outrage over the price of insulin. A number of individuals have raised concerns about insulin specifically and the cost of the drug in various FTC public meetings and kind of town hall style events. How do PBM's activities relate to the price of insulin that a patient with diabetes would pay at the pharmacy counter?
Yeah, so you're right. There's been a lot of attention on insulin, and for good reason. In a lot of ways, it's sort of the poster child of the issues that exist in this opaque pharmacy supply chain that we have, and has important consequences for patients. So I mentioned early there's this kind of distinction between list prices and net prices, and the difference there being the rebates and other concessions that manufacturers offer. Insulin is at the sort of extreme end of this, where the list prices that we hear about in the news are increasingly distorted from the net prices that manufacturers actually receive, to the tune of about at least a 50%, if not 60, 70% discounts off those list prices in terms of the revenue that manufacturers are actually receiving for the insulin products that they're producing. It's an incredibly competitive drug class. There are 3 big manufacturers that make this product, and that's kind of the prime example where a PBM is able to go and leverage that competition to say, we need bigger rebates if you want us to prefer you on our formulary. In some sense, to the extent that those savings are ultimately passed through in the form of a lower, let's say, flat dollar copayment to the patient at the pharmacy counter, or if those rebates are being passed through to their employer who can use them to reduce health insurance premiums, that can be a benefit. But what's happening is that that's not always the case. So many patients pay at the pharmacy counter when they fill a prescription. They don't have a flat copayment of say $20 or $25. Sometimes they are in a deductible, or they pay a coinsurance, which is a percentage of the list price of the drug, let's say 25% of the drug's list price. In that case, their cost sharing is much higher because it's based on this artificially inflated list price that's not reflective of the net price of the drug. And so in those instances, or if their health plan or employer aren't kind of sharing the rebate savings with them in the form of lower premiums or something like that, it can be very problematic for these patients who are ultimately kind of subsidizing the market by paying much higher at the pharmacy counter than they really should be, based on kind of how low the net prices of these drugs actually are.
Interesting. So looking at other things in the news related to insulin, the California Attorney General recently filed a lawsuit alleging that 3 of the largest insulin manufacturers, Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk, and Sanofi, along with 3 of the largest PBMs, CVS Caremark, Express Scripts, and Optum, had violated the California unfair competition law by artificially inflating the price of insulin and leveraging their market power to overcharge patients. Are you familiar with the case, and do you have a perspective on those allegations made by the California AG?
Yeah, so I think, there's a lot of insulin lawsuits going on today. One of the things that I think is unique about this California lawsuit is that it names both the manufacturers and the PBMs as defendants, and that's sort of a different twist. As you mentioned, there are allegations about kind of anti-competitive practices in these industries. I think, what's clear, as I just described, is that there is actually a lot of competition among the insulin manufacturers. I think, what a study by some of my colleagues at the Schaeffer Center, led by Karen Van Nuys, they were able to dig in using various filings and other publicly available data, specifically on insulin, to show that over the course of 2014 to 2018, the total expenditures that the healthcare system is kind of the dollars that we're putting into the broad market on insulin have actually been relatively stable over that time period for a given kind of 100 milliliter unit of insulin. But what's happened is that who's receiving those dollars has changed quite dramatically. The net prices that manufacturers receive for insulin declined by about 30% over that time frame, and instead more and more of those dollars are being captured by the supply chain, including PBMs and other intermediaries, to the point where by 2018 the majority of the dollars that we were spending on insulin are not going to the manufacturers of insulin, but are instead getting siphoned off by the supply chain. And so when you look at that trend, it's hard to reconcile that with an allegation that these manufacturers are engaging in anti-competitive practices when you see that the net price of the product that they've sold over this time period has actually declined quite considerably.
It's interesting. One of the things that you said earlier about how it kind of comes to pass that a patient that has coinsurance and is paying based on the list price, does indeed, face a, higher price at the pharmacy counter than, they may otherwise. So, clearly the amount that patients pay out of pocket is something that is really important to policymakers and, to their constituents. So in the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, that legislation includes a provision that imposes a $35 cap on a month's supply of insulin for seniors that are covered by Medicare. Do you have any thoughts or views on whether a kind of policy like this imposing price caps will help solve the problem?
Yeah, so this is actually kind of a long-winded answer, so you'll have to bear with me for a second, because to truly understand it takes some kind of reflection on the policy history of the Medicare Part D program. So it is certainly the case that starting this year, seniors enrolled in Medicare Part D plans now have a cap of $35 copayment cap on their insulin. And that will reduce cost sharing at the pharmacy counter for a number of beneficiaries and can improve their access and affordability and has very beneficial outcomes as a result of that. The twist, though, is that the reason for why it's making this improvement, I think, is not well understood. So back when the Medicare Part D program was being created in 2003 in the Medicare Modernization Act, the lawmakers at the time faced a budget constraint of $400 billion over 10 years, right? They were trying to hit a particular CBO score. And it turns out that when you forecasted how much seniors were going to spend on prescription drugs over the next 10 years, it was more than that. And so they had to do some kind of finagling to make this work. And what they did originally was include in the standard Part D benefit design something called a coverage gap or a donut hole, where a beneficiary would start the year, they'd be in the deductible, they'd pay the full price of their first couple fills, they'd move into something called the initial coverage phase, where the insurance would kick in and was supposed to pay about 75% of the cost of their drugs. They would pay about 25% of the cost of their drugs until they had a couple $1,000s in spending, at which point the insurance coverage would go away and they would enter into this coverage gap or donut hole phase where they would face the full cost of the drug until they had spending high enough to reach what's called the catastrophic coverage phase, where the government stepped in and plans stepped back in to pay all but 5% of the price of the drug. So needless to say, this coverage gap was highly unpopular, and it had a lot of implications for beneficiary affordability and access, and they were stopping filling their drugs and things like that. So legislators stepped in with the Affordable Care Act and basically said, we're going to fill in this coverage gap, but we're going to do it by requiring drug manufacturers to pay part of the cost and essentially kind of stepping in as the insurer in this donut hole or coverage gap phase. Subsequent legislation, the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, increased that. So manufacturers were now responsible for paying 70% of the list price of drugs in that benefit phase. What happened was that when Medicare went to implement that kind of newly filled in donut hole, they basically said that if you want that 70% discount, you cannot use the formularies that you're using in the initial coverage phase that reduce beneficiary copayments to $25 or so. So let's say I mentioned earlier on, right, that PBMs are negotiating these formularies with the manufacturers and saying, if you give me a bigger discount, I'll put you on a favorable tier and I'll charge the beneficiary, let's say, a flat copayment of $25 a month instead of a coinsurance of 25% of the list price. What happened is that that's happening in that initial coverage phase. But when Medicare went to implement this policy, they basically did it in a way that if you wanted to keep using your $25 copayment in this filled in donut hole, that 70% discount that the insulin manufacturer would owe would be calculated off that reduced $25 copayment rather than the list price of the drug. It's a very complicated kind of implementation story. But what that meant from the beneficiary's perspective is that whatever copayment they were facing in the initial coverage phase went out the window when they entered this coverage gap. On paper, it looked the same. It looked like it had been filled in. But in practice, mid-year, they would revert to owing a coinsurance off the list price of the drug. So we did a study and showed that what that meant for beneficiaries taking insulin is that their cost sharing would more than double in the middle of the year when they entered into this coverage gap phase, even though it was supposed to be filled in. So what happened is that the Inflation Reduction Act provision kind of steps in to correct for the market distortion that was created by the policy history that came before it. So it's a long, kind of complicated story. And yes, it will benefit beneficiaries, but the reason that beneficiaries were harmed to begin with is the kind of subsequent steamrolling of these kind of policy fixes and solutions one after the other to the problems that were created by the policy distortions themselves, not the kind of broader market writ large.
Well, there's certainly no easy answers to all of these very complicated questions. We thank you for you and all of your colleagues' efforts to study these and to bring your economic perspective to bear. Just sort of to wrap us up here, are there any sort of policy initiatives that you as an economist think that can be done to help these markets work better for the benefit of patients?
Yeah, I think one of the questions there is really thinking about and kind of getting more consensus around what is the outcome that we want, right? And we have to set that before we can analyze the policy solutions to get there. So a colleague of mine likes to joke, right? You can have widespread access, you can have low cost, or you can have high quality. Pick two, right? And so it's a tricky industry. And so I think, in a lot of these discussions, there's an intense focus around affordability and costs and things like that. And that is important. But we also know, particularly, there's a large body of economic research that shows the ties between expected returns and the innovation that the industry, the kind of investment in innovation that the industry is willing to undertake. And so not only is it a trade-off about access and affordability for the patients of today, but we also have to think about the patients of tomorrow, right? The highest price of a drug is one that doesn't exist, right? And so when there are a number of competing issues and objectives that we need to think about in terms of designing these policies and implementing them as well.
Well, thank you so much, Erin. I'll let Alicia take us to our next end of the segment.
That's right. Time is almost up. But before we let you go, we're going to ask you a question we ask all of our guests on our Curious Amalgam, and that is to first tell us something interesting about yourself that is completely outside of your professional life.
Okay. Well, when I graduated from college, my parents gave me a golden retriever as my graduation present, and I decided to name him Dave Roberts after the greatest stolen base in baseball history.
Can I ask, is the dog still alive?
He is not anymore, but it still was a good story.
Oh, was he a good dog at least?
He was a fantastic dog, yes.
Okay, and then the final thing we're going to do is play a little game we call the Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat!
The rules could not be simpler. Jeny is going to pull a surprise question out of our virtual hat. So, Jeny, take it away.
Okay, Erin. I virtually picked one question out, but I think since it didn't really seem to apply given your last answer, I'm going to choose a new question from our virtual hat, and that is, what book are you reading right now?
I started during the pandemic a book club with a virtual Zoom book club with my nieces. And so I've been reading a lot more young adult books than I otherwise would. And we are actually reading Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, and a throwback to to recognizing that the issues and angst of teens and tweens continues across many generations.
Oh, yeah, that book is a classic. That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being a fabulous guest on Our Curious Amalgam. Thank you, Jeny. And thank you, listeners. Join us next week on Our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.